So in 2010 or 2011, I can't remember what year it was, I got to do my first AGM summary here at Kingsley. So I stood up in front of the church and just sort of said how youth was going. And I used the word wicked a lot. The team is wicked, the year's been wicked, the games have been wicked, the kids are wicked. And after I finished speaking, one of the elders got up and he said, just to clarify, wicked is a good thing. BT means wicked in a good way. And I didn't even think anything of that. I just thought that everyone knew that the word wicked meant good. I'm obviously wrong. Language is funny, isn't it? Because words we use today can mean something they didn't mean 30, 40 or 50 years ago, in some cases even 5 or 10 years ago. And today's passage that we are going to look at has a word in it that we don't necessarily like in the modern church, that we push it back against a little bit. There have been viral spoken word poems about how we shouldn't use it, how we should distance ourselves from it. There have been leaders not using it to describe who we are and what we do. Now this morning I am just the messenger, and in James 1 verses 27, this word seems to be fairly important in summing up what we are meant to be as Christians. That word is religion. I must confess, I've always felt uncomfortable about people who would say, oh, I'm not religious, I'm a Jesus follower. As you all know, I love the book of James, and it was the first book that I really grabbed hold of. And I'd think, but James says religion is good. People would say they don't do things religiously, or religion isn't for them. Just give them Jesus. And I'd say, well, what about James? Because James says religion is good. Is James wrong? I remember as a young Christian, I was like, man, everyone seems to be saying everything about James is wrong. And I was struggling with this book. So if you can open up to the first chapter of James, we're going to have a look at that verse, but we're also going to scan through the whole first chapter, just to give ourselves an idea of what this looks like, and what it means to be religious. So 1 James 27 says this: religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. When I read that, I think religion doesn't seem too bad. That seems pretty good. James tells us that God actually finds this kind of religion pure and faultless, perfect. And over all the years, over all the translations, over all the scanning through and understanding the original languages, they haven't changed the word religion here to Christianity. They haven't changed the word here to Jesus follower or anything like that. The word in the Greek translates to religion. And religion in this context means religious practice or religious discipline, doing something religiously. I find that fascinating, because how do we deal with that? I'm happy to accept that the word religion has some bad connotations in the world. Well, when people say, oh, I'm not religious, I tend to ask, why not? I haven't been bold enough to say James says we should be, but maybe that's something we can try this week. I'm not an English wizard. I don't understand English super well. My wife's an English teacher, so that's how I got through most of my assignments in uni. But my suspicion is people don't actually dislike that we should be religious. My suspicion is people like what we have done to the word religion, how we have acted in the name of religion. The capital C Church has at times, over its history, done a pretty bad job of living up to this version of religion. But simply changing our word and distancing ourselves from it doesn't necessarily solve the problem, does it? Because we will probably mess up the next word we choose to use, and then we'll have to distance ourselves from that. And then in future years, we'll have to distance ourselves from another word. I actually think our humanity and our struggle in sin is something that should draw people towards us. Hey, we are not perfect, but we have a perfect God who forgives us. We are trying. So instead of distancing ourselves from this word, other people could see it, and maybe they would be interested by the fact that we are not perfect, yet we're trying. So what do we do about this fact that we don't like the word religion? We don't like the word religious. I'm a little bit more qualified to talk about that than the English language. Understanding what James is talking about, seeing the context of the time, understanding that context for us today, and then living it out so we might show people that Jesus is alive in us, that Jesus is alive in our hearts, and that our religious belief that he is the author and perfecter of life is actually something contagious and something that's really, really good news. So we're going to look at this in a few parts, but first of all, we're going to get a little bit of an understanding of what James isn't saying. Because it can be easy to see this and think, right, to be religious, we just have to look after people and not be beaten down by the world. And that's a really, really simplistic, quick view of it. But there's a lot more going on. Anyone cannot be beaten down by the world, and anyone can look after people. So what makes this unique to us as followers of Jesus? Without giving a huge overview, let's have a look from the start of chapter 1. Now, the reason why I really like the book of James is because it makes sense to me. And it makes sense to me because it doesn't follow a great pattern. It doesn't flow super naturally. So you read letters from Paul, and that has a flow. He'll say, he'll greet the church that he's speaking to. He'll bring up some problems that they're having. He will say, here's the way that we can fix them. Here's how you can glorify Christ in that. And then normally he'll also say, here's some people in that church that you can trust. Send my greetings to them. And then he'll finish his letter. That is not what James does. James chops and changes. He actually talks like I sweep. I see spots and sweep. And then I see spots and sweep. And then I see spots and sweep. I don't walk up and down. That's not me. I'm a chaotic person. So I resonate with this book. I'm reading it and there's things going on. And if you have a read, you quickly see this is a book that reads a lot more like Proverbs in a way. Lots of little one-liners, lots of little ideas in a short book. And that's intentional. It's written for people to remember the important bits so they might go and live them out. It was written with ideas being rehashed, seemingly in strange places, so that people might know they're important and they need to live them out. It was written with metaphors, so it would be tangible to the reader. And the reader today is us, but the original reader was very first century Christians, someone who up until very recently was probably Jewish. The book is written for the very first Messianic Jews, the very first church. James was a leader in the mother church of Jerusalem. So he's writing to those people who have been Jews, and now they're confronted with a new religion. And if you have a chance, you might have it in your cheat notes in your Bible. It might tell you a little bit about what was going on between that time, 40 and 70 AD. And then as you read James, you go, yep, he actually has the right to say what he's saying. So James would have been writing to these first century Christians, these brand new Christians, who were still swaying from their old life, particularly as Jews. The wrestle of tradition versus the new life they've been born into. The struggle of leaving behind the rules that they spent their whole life observing. Their change in status in the society they live in. The struggle of now being attacked for their new beliefs, their new religion, by the very people they've spent their lives close to. The challenge of understand what it means to be religious in the context of a new religion. So James opens this letter by telling the readers he knows from experience life is hard. We know from experience life is hard. That we'll go through trials and we should embrace those trials and challenges as that is what grows us and makes us perfect. James uses perfect 7 times in his 5 chapters. And it doesn't mean perfect necessarily as we think. Perfect here means to live a wholesome life. So James is saying here that as Christians, our lives should be whole. We shouldn't have our church life and our work life. We shouldn't have our school life and our youth life. We shouldn't have our uni life and our Christian friends life. It should be one whole thing that looks the same any day, any time of the week. And that's verses 2 to 4. Verses 5 to 18, James tells his readers that true wisdom comes from God. And if we are to follow him, we should ask for that wisdom to be revealed to us. He talks about poverty and wealth and how one will force us to trust in God and the other will fade away. Ask for wisdom to understand which one is the best. He tells us that God is generous, that he will give us all we need. And since he is generous, when we are making bad choices in life, we shouldn't be blaming God for the outcome. But instead, we should be looking at our lives and the choices we're making. Ask for wisdom in the decisions you're making. Now, a whole lot of this would have been pretty revolutionary to these Messianic Jews, because it actually speaks of something very different of what they're used to. James isn't listing off rules to follow here. He's not saying, do this, do this, do this, do this, do this, and then you will pass. He is giving guidelines for the way of living. Here's how you seek wisdom. Here's who you seek wisdom from. Here are the places in your life God's wisdom would actually be really helpful. And we finish by reading 19 to 26. And we round off the chapter with James essentially saying, don't just listen to the word, go out and live it. Again, something that would have been challenging to these people because knowing was really important. Knowing was an important thing to these people. Having the knowledge was where authority came from. James is flipping that and saying the authority as a Christian now comes from knowing the truth and living it out. Doing something with that. And then we find ourselves at verse 27. James says, religion that God finds pure and faultless is this. Like we've said, the word religion here is very intentional. Because like we have said, if nothing else, people around here would have understood it. They were religious. It was pretty normal to be religious in this time. Whether that be Jewish, whether that be some other religion, it was normal. James and the readers would have been thinking of their own lives, the positive influence religion has had on them. But they also would have been thinking about the negative that religion has had on them, because they've left theirs and they've found a new one. And that place that they were welcome, they're no longer welcome. Those friends that they had that cared for them now attack them. That place that they knew is now foreign. And like many of us, these people would have been thinking, well, religion doesn't actually seem so great, does it? Because look what these people are doing in the name of their religion to me. So here, the word religion is used because James gives these people and us something to compare to. He says, I'm about to tell you what a pure and faultless religion looks like in the eyes of God. And by God, James means the Trinitarian Christian God. I want you to step back from our worldview for a moment and think how big a deal that would have been for these people. This is actually what religion is. He's basically telling them what they were doing is not the way. This is the way. This is what religion is. This is the complete and fulfilled truth. So when people say, I don't like religion, I think the good question is why? What is it about religion that you don't like? Because the religion we have here is actually pure and faultless. Straight away we have an invitation to speak to someone about Jesus. I don't like religion. Well, why not? What's been your experience? Sympathize with them. Don't tell them that experience wasn't real. But there's an opportunity to offer an alternative story, a better story, a perfect story, a religion that is pure and faultless. It says, look after the widow and orphan in their distress. Now, sometimes we can lose a lot when we read the Bible way too literally. And this is one of those cases. Because it's important to know that James doesn't mean only look after the widow and the orphan. It's not just those two groups of people, right? In this culture, the most vulnerable people would have been those with no family. We've spoken about this before. Family in this culture was your lifeblood to society. It was your lifeblood to getting things done. And he singles out a widow and an orphan. So someone who, when they lose their husband, loses pretty much everything, and someone who, when they lose their parents, can't look after themselves. The Jews reading this would have had any number of Old Testament scripture in their head that they would have understood. That doesn't just mean those two groups of people. It means everyone who is downtrodden. Isaiah 1:17, as pretty much this passage. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. That is one of many Old Testament scriptures where the Jews are called to care. James is saying here to these new Christians, religion isn't about being right. It isn't about remembering rules. It isn't about walking around with status and structure. A perfect religion handed down by a perfect God is one of action. And action doesn't mean looking at what's just been said and said, well, there's a leper on the road. And James didn't say anything about lepers, so I'm not going to help the leper. You know, that's not what it means. For these Jews, they would have understood that that means the most downtrodden. For us, I guess in some ways we could understand this more understanding the words of Jesus. Matthew 22:37, love your neighbour as yourself. Or Matthew 25:40, for what you did for the least of these, you did also for me. And we can understand that because we understand the scriptures of Jesus. But that would have been completely foreign to these people. So instead, James speaks to them with language they understand. The widow and the orphan means the most downtrodden. Look after them. Take care of them. James says that is pure and faultless. That is a religion that God loves. So why do we not like the word religion? Why don't we call ourselves religious? To religiously follow God in looking after those who cannot be looked after seems like a good thing to do. But it doesn't stop there. James also says that a pure and faultless religion is one that doesn't allow us to be polluted by the world. And I like this because I think, particularly in this day and age, it is really obvious what being polluted by the world looks like. I don't necessarily buy into the culture wars that are being created to divide. I actually think it's far more obvious in the fact that more and more the world is looking individualistic. The world is looking, it's about the individual. And from what I've seen, more and more, the Christian church is looking like community. We are doing things together. That is how we get stuff done. So there's a clear divide to me from the world and our Christian community, individual versus community. And the more we read the scriptures, the more we understand that almost everything is done in community, not individualistically. So as we read this, we can ask, what does it mean to not be polluted by the world? What does that look like really? I think the answer is actually simple, and it comes from that passage in Matthew. Love God. If you want to not be polluted by the world, understand who God is. Understand what God has done for you. Understand what He's called you from and to. And love Him. And you can quite clearly see the difference in the world and the things that He loves. To not be polluted by the world means to love God. It means to see what He does and choose to live that way. Every day, reminding yourself all the time. James is saying here to these Messianic Jews that we should love God, and in loving God we should love others. Jesus says that, and it's a pretty important commandment. As we are not being polluted by the world, we are able to show that alternative story. We're able to show the world that we care for our neighbour because they are beings created by God and we are beings created by God. And we cannot do anything else. And we will do it religiously. Again, something I think that's good. Being polluted by the world doesn't mean we list off all the bad things in the world that we should stay away from. Because, to be perfectly honest, the things that pollute my life might not pollute yours at all. The areas, the people, the situations that I would find would stress me out, that I would be tempted by, all those sorts of things, They might not actually faze you. And you might actually be able to go into that community, that situation, and speak life. Now, in the same way, things that would pollute your life might not pollute mine. And I can go speak into those. Isn't it a good thing that as we look at the world and Christianity, we are a community? Because not being polluted actually goes hand in hand with being a community, trusting each other. Not being polluted by the world doesn't mean listing off all the bad things and saying, stay away from these. Now, in some cases, that's a good thing to do. Don't rob banks, we can list that down. But let's not get too legalistic about it. Imagine a community that is praying for each other, not as individuals, but as a group of people who are going into the world, not being polluted by it, and actually religiously sharing Jesus. Trusting that the areas that you walk into might be a struggle for me, but I'm trusting they're not a struggle for you. You trusting the areas that might be a struggle for you might not be a struggle for someone else, and they're going in and speaking life. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after the widow and orphan in their distress and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. I hope this week, as you go out, you are happy to use the word religious. I am religious. Like we said, it's a conversation starter. Hey, you've got a bad experience? Let's talk about that. Because here's my experience of a pure and faultless religion. And it's actually really awesome. I'd love to share with you. I'd love to invite you into this community of people who are also living that out. Is there something polluting parts of your world? Again, who can you talk to in the community? Ask God for wisdom and do something about that. Are there ways you could be living out your faith in more practical situations? Ask God for wisdom, seek the people around here in this community, and find ways to be doing that. I do hope you're challenged by this. It's challenged me, even though I kind of like the word religion. I've still sort of been like, yeah, but religion is also kind of a bad word. So I've been challenged as well, and I hope you've been challenged. More than that, I hope you are challenged to chat to the community we have here and do something about what we are told to do in James. Let's pray. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for the different authors that you have used. Thank you for James. Thank you for Paul. Thank you for Luke. Thank you for all of them, that they have a different way of writing and they're speaking to different people, but ultimately sharing the same message, that you are God, that you are in control, that you love us, and that you want to see more people come to know who you are and be saved into your kingdom. So this morning, as may we wrestle with the idea of religion, as we wrestle with what it means to be happy that we are religious, may we go out and live a religious life this week that God accepts as pure and faultless. May we do a good job in looking after those who cannot look after themselves, and may we also do a good job in not being polluted by this world. Thank you for who you are, what you've done in our lives, what you're doing in this community, and we give you all the praise and glory. Amen.